Wrong button. Hold on 1 second. There we go.
Certainly.
Okay. So as Ross said, I'll be talking to you today, and my topic is going to be managing high availability and disaster recovery in SQL Server with DBATools. And I'll get into what DBATools is early on. Ross covered most of this. Been in IT for 23 years, last 15 as working with SQL Server. I started my career as kind of a traditional database administrator, so I was involved in kind of standing environments up, migrating things to them, making sure that they ran. The last, now going on 8 years, I've been working as a consultant. Currently a senior consultant at a company called Fortified Data. I love to learn, and as Ross said, the group is always looking for presenters, and presenting is a great way to learn a topic. Every time I do a presentation, I learn more than I thought I could about the topic, and then every time I give a presentation, somebody asks me a question I don't know the answer to, and so it's just kind of a constant process of gaining new information. I love internals, and on the SQL Server side, that I focus on things like the transaction log and how the transaction log processes and how it works, kind of page structures, index structures, that kind of thing. How SQL Server does things kind of underneath the covers, because I find that the more you know, or at least in my case, the more I understand about how that works, the better I am at making decisions for things like indexing and kind of just application code, how to write T-SQL code to perform ideally. In the before times, I was a volunteer at the Art Institute of Chicago. I'm waiting for them to reestablish that program, but I love museums. And my contact information is here, my Twitter handle, my email, and my blog. I've made a resolution to blog more this year, and that hasn't panned out real well, but there's some interesting information there. And with that, I'll get into the presentation. Before I start talking about DBATools, DBATools is a community-developed PowerShell module for administering SQL Server. And the people who have created DBATools, and you can see their names on the cover of this book, Chrissy Lemaire, Rob Sewell, Jess Pomfret, and Claudio Silva, have authored a book called Learn DBATools in a Month of Lunches. And the way the book is structured is each chapter is designed to be run through in about 45 minutes to an hour. And so the idea is that you go through a chapter at lunch, you can play with those ideas, and then you can work your way through the book. And the MEAP, or MEAP, on the cover is the Manning Early Adopter Program, I believe. And Manning Publications, who published the book, when they contract with somebody to write a book, they will put it in this program, and then you buy the book, and as chapters become available, they are published online. And one of the really nice things about Manning is they have a feature called Live Book. So once you've bought the book, you have the option to purchase a physical copy, an electronic copy, but in either case, you have the ability to log into Manning's website, and you have basically a virtual copy of the book that's accessible from anywhere you have a browser. And I actually wrote that, or started this presentation while I was waiting to get my oil changed. I pulled up the book on my laptop and ran through the chapter on HADR and was able to put kind of an outline for this together. So it's a really great book. The 4 people you see there have done incredible work to get this module out and available. It's available for free download, and it's just a really remarkable thing. So this is what we're going to cover. I'll talk some more about DBATools. I'll talk about the HADR options available in SQL Server. And then I'm going to cover and demo configuring log shipping with DBATools, monitoring and sort of interrogating a failover cluster instance with DBATools, and then creating, configuring, and monitoring availability groups using DBATools. As I go through, Ross, I'll pause every once in a while. I don't know if somebody drops a question in the chat, if you can read it to me. Otherwise, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your questions as I'm going through or when I stop. I'm always happy to answer questions. And as I said, if I don't know the answer, I will find it out and can get the information to you. So DBATools, what is it? The official word from the DBATools website is it's the community module that enables SQL Server pros to automate database development and server automation. My take is that along with Ola Hollingren's maintenance solution and baseballreference.com, it's one of the coolest things on the internet. It's a community developed PowerShell module. It started out as a migration tool, and it still has all of that migration functionality. There are commands to copy, copy tables, copy data, copy logins, copy jobs, and then all of those copy jobs are wrapped in a command called start DBA migration. And at its simplest, you start DBA migration, you give it a source and a destination. So an instance that you want to migrate from and an instance you want to migrate to. And as long as everything's set up in terms of security and connectability, it will take everything from your source and move it to your destination. And if you've ever run a migration of a SQL Server, it can be very, very painful. You miss things. There's code that gets missed. There may be a login that gets missed, a link server. With this command, it will just really simplify your life. There are over 500 commands currently, and as things in SQL Server change and as new features are introduced, they are constantly updating and adding functionality. This is once again from their website. I think the most important thing here is the word automate, because there are many things that you can do in SQL Server that you can do one-off, and you might have to do that thing a dozen times. And if you've got to do it a dozen times, it can be, error prone. And so if you can standardize a script to do something and then automate that standardized script, it goes a long way to preventing errors. It goes a long way to making your job easier and taking the tasks that are sort of routine and redundant, automating them and giving you the opportunity to do things that are more interesting. So SQL Server HADR, as I was saying, can be configured using SQL Server Management Studio. And that's great for if you're doing it one time. If I'm building an availability group and I'm just doing it once, I can run through the wizard and do that. But if I have an environment where I have to stand up availability groups on a regular basis, and I need those availability groups to have the same standards applied, having that script and having that ability to rerun the same commands is a real lifesaver. T-SQL scripts can be generated and updated for each run, but once again, you're going through a T-SQL script and you're possibly doing a group replace, and that is error prone. You might miss something, you might fat finger something. With a DBATools script, because it's PowerShell, you can standardize that script and then use parameters to pass values in. So you just set it once and it will push it through the script and do a variable replace. So getting a hold of DBATools, the simplest way to do it, and if you're running a PowerShell window from under administrator rights, all you have to do is type install-module space DBATools, and it will give you a prompt to update a NuGet package, which is the package that PowerShell uses to download modules. And then it'll prompt you that, do you really want to download this? And once you do that, it will install it and you are set. The documentation for DBATools is really nice. And you can get a hold of that documentation at dbatools.io. And then there's also a page at that website with other options for getting a hold of it. So if you're sitting behind a firewall, or you don't have the ability to download using the install module, there are other options for getting a hold of the DBATools module. This went back. I'm going backwards. Sorry about that. Hitting the wrong arrow key. So this is a screenshot from the DBATools website, and these are all the categories of commands that are available. I like to say that anything you can do in SQL Server, for the most part, you can do with DBATools. You can just take a look through here and see what is available. The three categories that I'm going to talk about, availability groups, log shipping, and failover clustering, are highlighted. But you've got the migration category, SQL agent, so you can administer agent jobs, agent operators, agent alerts. You can do backups and restores. You can pull back any information about databases, and you can do this all within PowerShell scripts using these commands. So, any questions about DBATools before I get into HADR?
Yes, Frank, we had a request to, if you could, a couple slides back, you had a found here link.
Yep.
Okay.
So let me
share that and paste it in the chat.
Yep. Open that up. Yeah, and as I said, this is the page. So those are the commands I was looking at. And then underneath here, you've got all the commands. And if you click on a command, if you're familiar with PowerShell, they basically mimic the help. If you do a get help on a PowerShell command, it will give you text that looks very much like this. So it gives you the syntax of the command with all the parameters that are possible. It gives you a list of examples, and then your parameters, required and optional, what they are, what the data type is. And then one of the really neat things is that this is an open source project. So if you have an idea for a command, you can write that. You can contact them and they will get it into their build. And because it's an open source project, here at the bottom, I have a link to GitHub. So if I click this link, it will take me to their GitHub repository. And this is the actual code that sits behind that get DBA database command. And this is really valuable. If you know PowerShell, as I've been working with some of this stuff, I've run into issues where the command's not doing exactly what I expect it to do. And by coming in here and looking at the code, I can figure out, okay, this is what the code's actually doing. And it's doing what it's supposed to. It's not doing what I expect it to, but in that case, I can either write my own code or modify the code as it exists. And it's also a really nice way, if you are interested in PowerShell, it's a great way to learn PowerShell because these people are really good at PowerShell. And so you can get an idea of how to do things that by looking at this code for examples. So if there's nothing else, I'll get.
There is one other question.
Yep.
And that's, is there a base version of PowerShell that's needed for DBATools?
I want to say PowerShell 3, but if you can get to PowerShell 5, you'll have a better support for some of the stuff they're doing. Right now I think PowerShell 7.2 is the current version, but I would say I would say 5 as kind of what I would be comfortable with. So that's where I would go.
Okay, great. Thank you, Frank.
No problem. All right. Excuse me. So high availability and disaster recovery in SQL Server. There are more options than this, but these are the three that I'm going to talk about. And the three are log shipping, failover cluster instance, and availability groups. Starting with log shipping. Log shipping has been around forever. I keep meaning to go back and see how long forever is, but I believe it's at least SQL Server 7, if not before, and that goes back to the 1990s. The reason that it's been around forever is that it's a fairly simple process. Basically, it has 3 phases. You have a source and you have a destination, and you are running transaction log backups on your source. You are then copying those backup files to a secondary location, and then there's a restore job that's picking up those transaction log backups and restoring them on the secondary. All 3 of these phases are run by SQL Server agent jobs, and you can set this up using Management Studio. But once again, the process of running through the wizard, there are, tens, if not hundreds of options that you're setting, and you're copying in file paths. You're doing a lot of things that could potentially go wrong, or you could make a mistake. And if it's something that you need to do more than once, the DBATools scripts take a lot of that error proneness out of it. For a period of time, probably about 5-6 years ago, there was talk that Microsoft was going to deprecate log shipping, which meant that it would no longer be kind of part of the product, the Management Studio wizards, and they've since backed off from that. But as I said, because of the simplicity of this process, you could roll your own. You can build your own agent jobs to do the backups, to do the copy, to do the restore. Log shipping does have limited read-only capability on that secondary side. Basically, you put the database in a mode called standby, and so the secondary database is available to receive additional restores of log files, but you can read that data. The reason I said it's limited is that while that if there is someone connected to that secondary database doing reading, a restore can't run. So there's an option when you set up log shipping to say, okay, before you run the restore, boot everybody out of that secondary database. So if you're running this on a 15-minute cadence, it can be kind of tricky to do that read only, but it is there. You just need to know what the limitations are. And then one of the other things that I really like about log shipping is that it's fairly bulletproof. If one of these phases fails, the others will continue to run successfully. And an example I've got of this is I had a client who had log shipping set up, and they were running it between data centers. Over a weekend, the network connection between the data centers was lost. It went down. And so the log backups continue to run successfully on the primary side. They just couldn't copy over. So came in Monday, logged on, saw what had happened, worked with the networking team to get that connection reestablished. And as soon as that happened, it started copying those files and doing the restores on the secondary side. So it is pretty forgiving in terms of kind of that failure in one of the phases. So that is log shipping requirements are that the agent account must be an Active Directory account. The backup destination, you need read-write permissions for the primary agent account and read permissions of secondary. The copy destination, the secondary needs read-write. And then if you're going to run the demo code, and Ross, I can send you a link to my GitHub that contains all of the code I'm going to run. If you want to try this out yourself, you need to meet these requirements before running that demo code. And that'll take us into the demo. So I have running on my laptop a pair of SQL Server instances. This is my local, just my default instance. And then I have a named instance called Tony. And I'll expand out agent jobs. Let's see, did I not remove this? Hang on one second. Let me just expand this out. All right. Over to the demo code. clean a couple of things up. So as I said, I'll provide Ross with a link to my GitHub, and it will contain this demo code using Azure Data Studio and Jupyter Notebooks. So this gives me the ability to format text and then have runnable code in line. So I'll be running through this top to bottom and running these individual pieces of code. The syntax of a PowerShell command is verb noun. So you'll have a verb dash and then what that verb is going to act on. And in the case of DBATools, all of their commands have DBA after that dash. So that's one of the ways you can identify a DBATools command. And then if it's working at the database level, it'll be DBA DB. So in this case, I'm running a pair of commands. One is remove DBA DB log shipping from localhost and localhost Tony. And then I'm going to, if this ls test dr database exists on the Tony instance, it's going to drop it. Confirm equals false just says don't prompt me, because notebooks don't play nice with interactivity. So this will just run the command and just going to go. So I will run this, and I flip back. Answer the studio. Fingers crossed. Okay. You can see that I've got this ls backup ls test job here. If I refresh this, yeah, so having removed, I was running tests earlier today to set this up. So I've removed that agent job. So now what I'm going to do is come down to the next code block. And because this is all running on my laptop, all of these paths for the backup destination, the copy location, and the restore location are all local to my C drive. So I'm running remove item, which is just a standard PowerShell command to delete any files out of these paths. And then I've got what's called a splat, and that's this @ curly brace, close curly brace. And what a splat allows you to do is each of these lines from 6 to 26 are parameters for the invoke DBA log shipping command. And I could put each one of these terms or parameters on the left side of the equal after this command with a dash, and then follow that with the value I want to give it. That gets really, really hard to read if I'm dealing with 20 odd parameters. So by coding this splat, I can define all of my parameters and set a value for each one. And then I just pass in this @ params, and PowerShell resolves all of these all these parameters. So it just makes your code more readable. It makes it easier to edit. And so it's just a really, really nice feature. Just running through these parameters quickly. I've got my source instance, my destination instance, the database I want to log ship, the shared path that is copied to, the local path that backups are running to. And then it's creating, the command is going to create each of those agent jobs, the backup job, the copy job, and the restore job. And so I have the ability to set the frequency. So I basically set the schedule of those jobs. For the purposes of this demo, I don't want those jobs running on a schedule. So I am able to disable each of them here. I can tell it to compress my backups. And then I am giving it a secondary database suffix. So what's going to happen is ls test is my database on the primary. And when it creates the database on the secondary side, it's going to put a DR after it, just to indicate that that is a log shipping secondary. Give it the copy to destination folder. And then finally, force is going to tell it, run the command, don't ask me anything. Standby, that's where it's going to flip it to be readable on the secondary side. And then disconnect users equals true. That's the parameter that says, okay, I know that I can't do a log shipping restore if there's somebody in the database reading it. So prior to running the restore, it will kick everyone out of the database and then run the restore. So I'm going to run the invoke DB log shipping command with these parameters by clicking this play button. And if I have offered sufficient sacrifice to the demo gods, I should get success. And now if I refresh my job list on the secondary, you will see I've got ls copy, localhost ls test, ls restore localhost ls test. And then on my primary side, I will have ls backup underscore ls test. So by running that one command with that parameter block, I have successfully configured log shipping. Going through this with the wizard would take 10, 15 minutes, and I'd be copying and pasting, file paths, setting up a schedule. I've been able to do that all with a single click here. So I want to select from a table in both databases because it's in standby on the secondary side. I can run that select. There's a single table in the database. It's called test table. It's got 3 columns, an identity column, and then 2 text columns. So if I run this, you'll see that on the primary side, I have 1 row that is 1 log shipping. On the secondary side, the same values. So because log shipping's been configured, I've backed the database up from the primary side, restored it on the secondary side. So the table contains the same data. I'm now going to run an insert into my primary table. So I'm just inserting a row with the values is resilient. And if I run this, it has run. And now if I do that select from both sides again, you will see that I've got 2 rows on my primary side, the log shipping, and then is resilient. And that change is not yet reflected on the secondary side because the log shipping jobs have not run, but I can kick them off manually. So start DBA agent job. That is another DBATools command. Give it the instance and the job name. Gonna wait, the start sleep. We'll just wait for 5 seconds to confirm that each job completes before the next one runs. So I'll run that, take about 15 seconds. And it gives me a status or a completion for each job. There's my copy. And restore should come through in just a second. There you go. And now if I run that select again, you can see I've got 2 rows on both sides. Oh, sorry. 2 rows on both sides. So the backup, copy, and restore ran. And so the change to my primary side is now reflected on my secondary side. So log shipping is really a disaster recovery tool. High availability implies that you can do automatic failover and you can move between the primary and secondary very quickly. And log shipping, while you can make that switch, it's more of sort of a long-term thing, a disaster recovery thing. And there's a scooter on my street, so if there's noise in the background, I apologize. So basically what I'm going to do now is mimic a failure of my primary instance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the SQL Server service on my primary side, and then I'm going to stop all of the processes on my secondary side running in the ls test dr database. So it's going to effectively shut down my primary instance and then kick everyone out of the secondary database to allow me to switch from the default instance being my primary to that named instance, Tony. It'll bring that database online fully. So it'll no longer be in standby mode. It will be in recovery, and then it will be usable as a database would normally be. So once again, this is mimicking imagining these two instances are running in separate data centers. Somebody cuts the power or the network connection to my primary data center with a backhoe or something else. I now have the ability to do this move to the secondary side and bring my applications up pointing at that secondary database. So I'll kick this off and it should tell me that it's waiting for the service to stop. The service is now stopped. I have killed everything in that secondary database. And you'll notice here that it's giving me messages that my system databases, wide world importers, and WWI_big are not configured as a secondary database for log shipping. And the reason it's doing this is that what the command's doing is it's looking at each database on the instance and saying, hey, is this set up for log shipping? If it isn't, just skip past it. But that one database, in this case, that is set up for log shipping, that switch over will happen. And hopefully this will come back fairly quickly. Anybody have any questions about log shipping while we're waiting? And actually, something I should show you. I don't know if it'll show up here. So I don't know if I refreshed. So you'll see here that ls test dr is in standby/read only. So that is the state of the database. And if this does come back, and I hope it does, it'll be less than exciting if it doesn't. Check something. Running.
We do have a question back
Sure.
from the earlier part of the presentation that doesn't have to do with log shipping. So
Okay.
I don't know if you want to wait till
No.
the end or
Hit me with it while I'm waiting.
does it help? Does DBATools help in moving a Oracle database to SQL Server?
No. Everything is SQL Server specific. Yeah, that is the scope. Basically, SQL Server is the scope in terms of moving from a different location. There are tools within PowerShell, native PowerShell, that will assist with that. Being able to do a bulk copy or being able to move data, but DBATools is specific to SQL Server. Oh man.
So no Oracle, no Postgres or anything else?
No. And my knowledge of those DBMSs is fairly limited. With SQL Server expanding into Linux, I don't know if there's kind of a footprint for those things in PowerShell or in other, other places. But I do know that you can. There are tools to move that data that are native to SQL Server. It's just not DBATools.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
No problem. All right, so this is still clocking, and I'm not entirely sure why. So I'm going to let it run, and I'm going to jump back into the presentation, and I'll come back to it in a couple of minutes and see if it comes back. Let me just check and see exactly what's running one more time. There is nothing running. All right, finally came back. Patience is a virtue. All right, so it was successful. The Tony database, it scanned through the rest of the databases. Now, if I do a refresh on the Tony ls test dr on Tony, you will see that it is recovered. There's no longer any special state information after the database name. And just to prove that it's accessible, I will just run a select against the ls test dr database, and you'll see those two rows come back. So now if this was an actual sort of disaster recovery scenario, what you would do is your applications that were pointing to that default instance, you would need to change those connection strings to point at the named instance, and it would allow your application to continue to run. And you would have, up to that the last available log backup. That would be your recoverability. The last thing I want to do before I forget is restart my primary instance, just so I don't get a nasty surprise when I try to use it tomorrow. So that's log shipping. Any questions now? If you don't think of the question now, you can ask me at the end, and you can always shoot me an email, and I'm happy to.
Well, I have a question.
Sure.
So you've shown us how to basically take the log shipped database on the secondary server and make it the primary.
Right.
So now we've got our data center back, the original primary data center back. So how do we put Humpty Dumpty back together again?
So you got a couple of options. So you are now running on that secondary side. You could, reestablish log shipping and then do that cutover. So the example that I used here was showing you, okay, I've lost data center, the primary data center. I could run this and run this and flip back from Tony to the primary instance once you've rebuilt log shipping using the named instance as your primary. You could also, do just a full backup from the primary or the new primary side, restore it on the new secondary, and then reinitiate log shipping. You've got a couple of different options. And you could use these scripts to kind of automate that process, to have that script canned and know what that process is. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's another nice thing about these scripts is that you can, create them on the front end. You can use them in your disaster recovery exercises. And, if you are familiar with what they do and have them in a repository, it just makes these things a lot easier. So that we will take a look at failover cluster instances. So a failover cluster instance is an instance of SQL Server that is running as a clustered resource in a Windows Server failover cluster. An FCI contains at least 2 nodes, and one node runs as the primary and hosts those clustered resources. So if you're familiar at all with Windows Server failover clustering, what you're doing is basically linking 2 or more servers together, and those servers share a group of resources. In the case of a SQL Server failover cluster instance, the resources that are being shared are generally the SQL Server service, the SQL agent service, and then any storage that's associated with the database. Sort of the standard configuration is you'll have a log drive and a data drive that is hosting your transaction log files and your data files. And that storage has to be accessible to all of the nodes, all of the nodes in that cluster. So you can have geo-located failover cluster instances. So I could have, a data center in Chicago, a data center in Texas. But the challenge there is that those nodes all have to be able to access the files, the storage that's associated with the databases on the instance. On failover, you are failing over at the instance level. So in the example of this Tony instance, I have a number of user databases. I also have my system databases. My master database contains things like logins and security at the instance level. And then the MSDB database contains information about my SQL Server agent jobs and my operators and my alerts. When I fail over, all of all of these databases fail over because it's pointing at the storage that those databases live on. So it's just an important thing to keep in mind. And basically what's happening at that failover time is the instance is running on my primary server. It effectively shuts down on that primary server, and then those resources move over to the secondary server, and your SQL Server instance starts up. And you can actually look at the error log when a failover cluster instance fails over and see that activity happening. You'll see the shutdown on the primary, and then you'll see it start up on the secondary. So because failover cluster instance is so sort of intertwined with Windows Server failover clustering, a lot of the work to set up a failover cluster instance is happening on the Windows side of things. And so DBATools, they made a decision to, because it's a SQL Server oriented tool, there aren't DBATools commands to build out a failover cluster instance. And in the interest of making this presentation less than 3 hours long, I didn't include, there are PowerShell commands to build out a failover cluster, and it works really well. I just didn't want to have to run through a demo to build all that stuff out because it's a fairly extensive process. But what DBATools does have are commands to return information about failover cluster instances. And this is really useful for gathering information about a clustered instance. And one of the things that's really nice about them is that all I need to know is a server that is a node in the cluster. And I can run these commands just passing in that server, and it will return all of the information about the cluster that that node is participating in. So as a consultant, if I go into an environment and they say we're running clusters, we're not entirely sure what's where and what belongs, they can just give me one server, or I can even just scan the environment for instances of SQL Server and then run these commands, and it will build an inventory of cluster resources for me. And you can do this remotely. All the DBATools commands, with the exception of a couple, can be run remotely. You can pass in a list of instances. If you're using registered servers or CMS, you can source servers from there and run these things against an entire environment. So the 3 commands I believe that I'm going to talk about. First one is get DBAWFC node, and this will return information about each of the nodes in the cluster. So in this case, I am passing it the computer name of my server 1, and it comes back and tells me that my server 1 is participating in a cluster called my cluster with a fully qualified domain name of mycluster.local.com. And then there is a second node in that cluster called my server 2. I'm terribly creative with my dummy names, but it gives you a sense that one server will get me all of that information. So from the WSC node, I also have WSC role, and this will give me the cluster roles. So the roles are available storage, the cluster group, and then the SQL Server cluster. So these roles are all part of that Windows Server failover cluster. And once again, all I had to do is pass it the computer name of one of the nodes, and it gives me that information. And then finally, and this is to my way of thinking the most interesting, is get WSFC resource. So this will pull back all of the information about the resources running to include the services and all of that shared storage. Once again, I just need to pass it that single computer name, and you'll see that I get cluster disk 1, cluster disk 2, which would generally be your log drive and your data drive, and then information about the services, the SQL Server service on the right and the SQL Server agent service. So these are the clustered resources. That being said, you're not limited to the 2 drives. So it's possible that you could have a failover cluster instance that is running a group of databases, and one of those databases may have its own set of data and log drives. Those can be created as cluster resources, and they will fail over just like the other drives do. So that is failover cluster, the coverage of failover cluster instance. As I said, it's not as exciting. There's no demo code, but just know that the commands are there. And if you do need to find information about instances that are running as FCIs, it makes it really easy to pull that information back. And the DBATools is designed to make it really easy to output this stuff to a CSV file or an Excel file, or even you can dump it directly into SQL Server. So if you wanted to build an inventory database to find out where all your databases are and where all your failover cluster instances are, you can run these commands and then just dump that straight into a database that then you can query and report off of. There's just a lot of flexibility in the DBATools module, and I'm kind of just scratching the surface of one piece of it here. So any questions about FCIs before I move on, Ross?
No, we're good.
Okay, cool. What time am I at? Okay, try to get done in about 15 minutes. So I will talk about availability groups now. So availability groups also run on top of a Windows Server failover cluster, but they are very different than an FCI in that there is no shared storage. And the failover is not at the instance level, it's the availability group level. With an AG, you have a primary instance and you can have up to 8 secondary replicas. Because there is no shared storage, each one of these replicas has a local copy of the data and log files for the databases that are in the availability group. Databases are contained in that availability group, and one instance can host multiple availability groups. So, a kind of standard use pattern is you may have application-based availability groups. So you've got 8 databases on an instance, 4 of them support application 1, 4 of them support application 2, have an availability group per application. The way that the availability groups work is my primary instance has my OLTP workload running against it. So transactions are running against that primary instance. Data is being updated, inserted, deleted. As those transactions are committed on that primary instance, the log blocks associated with those transactions are sent to the replicas. You've got 2 options for how that traffic is sent. There's synchronous and asynchronous. With synchronous, I have a transaction. Let's say I insert a row to my primary database. The log blocks associated with that insert are sent to my synchronous secondary. And then once that insert is applied on the secondary, there's a notification that is sent back to the primary. And at that point, the transaction will fully commit. And this is used for high availability. So I've got 2 instances running in the same data center, possibly on servers in the same rack. The latency between them is minimal, and so I can afford to have that synchronous connection. Asynchronous is for disaster recovery. So I've got my 2 replicas running in data center 1, providing high availability. I've got data center 2 that may be 10 miles or 100 miles or 500 miles away. Because of the way electrons work and physics works, as you increase the distance between those replicas, you also increase the latency with which communication happens. And so asynchronous says, okay, I'm processing my transactions on my primary side, and I'm writing those log blocks to that asynchronous secondary, but I don't want to have to wait for that notification to come back. So it just pushes the log blocks over, and the secondary applies them as it can. And there's no notification, there's no bottleneck that happens because of that, that application on the secondary side. The downside to that is that you have the potential for data loss. That's because you may have records that are queued up on the primary side. You may have records that are queued up, or log blocks that are queued up on the secondary side. And if you do a failover, if that stuff hasn't applied on the secondary side, that data is going to be lost because it'll be flushed out of the log cache. So that is, next bullet point says, this provides both high availability and disaster recovery. And then you have the ability to set a secondary replica to be read-only. So this is designed to be able to offload a reporting workload from your primary instance. So I've got my primary instance, that's where all my transactions are hitting. I want that to run as quickly as possible. If I run reports against that, it can cause blocking and locking that will slow down my OLTP performance. By setting one of my replicas as readable, I can point my reporting workload there and I get that data back. If it's synchronous, it is near real time, but I don't have that collision with my transactional workload. For the failover, so synchronous commit mode, you can set an automatic, you can set failover to automatic, and you're not going to lose any data. That provides the high availability. You set to async for those geo-replicated replicas. And then if you want to do a planned failover to a async secondary for a DR test or something like that, you have the ability to switch from asynchronous to synchronous, and then you can monitor it and see once it catches up, it will tell you, okay, I'm good. You can fail over with no data loss, and you can then do that planned failover. That is something that you need to monitor to guarantee that you're not going to lose any data, but you do have that capability. Okay, so that takes me into my demo. I thought I had one more slide, but no big thing. All right, so for the purposes of this demo, I have 3 VMs in Azure. I have a domain controller that's doing all my domain stuff. And then I've got VM01 and VM02. VM01 is hosting a single database, worldwide importers, and I am going to build an availability group to run synchronous between these 2 replicas. You can see, let's refresh, I got nothing up my sleeve. There are currently no user databases on the O2 instance. And I'm going to go back into another notebook. So just a little bit about prerequisites for availability groups. You do need to build out that Windows Server failover cluster and join both of the servers hosting the instances to it. When you build that cluster, there's a checkbox that says add all available storage. You uncheck that when you're building the cluster for an availability group. Each instance needs to be running Enterprise or Developer Edition, and they've got to be the same version. Availability groups, as I am demoing them, are an enterprise-only feature, and so that's why you need Enterprise or Developer. There is a thing called basic availability groups, but you are limited to a single database, a single replica, and I don't believe you have read-only capability there on the replica side with basic availability groups. The log and data paths should be the same. I will say that they 99.999% must be the same. You can set them up differently, so I could have a D data drive and an E log drive on my primary, an F data drive and a G data drive on my secondary, and it will work, but it can be a nightmare to troubleshoot and diagnose problems. So I would say if you're going to stand up an availability group, make sure the pathing to your data and log files is the same. You've got to enable always on availability groups for each instance. And this is done, it can be done through the SQL Server Configuration Manager, or you can do it with the enable DBA HADR command. And it's basically once you've added the instance into a cluster, the server running the instance into a cluster, you'll be able to do this. It does require a restart once you check that box or run the DBATools command. So just keep that in mind. And then every database that you're going to add into the availability group has to be in full recovery mode. And it also, once it is in full, so if I've got a database in simple, which in the case of my wide world importers, that defaults to simple. So I flip that to full. I have to run a full backup because once you say alter database set recovery equal full, it isn't actually in full until that full backup runs. So just something to keep in mind. And then we will build an AG. So I'm going to use the new DBA availability group command. Once again, I've got a param splat. So I'm giving it my primary instance or primary replica, my secondary replica. I'm giving my availability group a name, telling it what database to include. And this is can be a comma delimited list. So if I've got 10 databases on my instance, I can specify each of them here. Automatic for my seeding mode. So when you are building an availability group, I've got a database on my primary and I'm going to put that on my secondary. When availability groups were first introduced in SQL Server 2012, your options here were, you had one option, and that was to take a full backup of your database from the primary, restore it on the secondary and no recovery, and then take a log backup from your primary and restore it to the secondary in no recovery. And then you'd be able to build the availability group. They then added functionality that allowed you to provision a shared location that both primary and secondary could see, and it would run the backups from their primary to that shared location and then do the restores on the secondary side. With 2016, they introduced automatic seeding, and this is basically a setting that says, okay, I'm going to build this availability group with the wide world importers database. I want SQL Server will do that data transfer behind the scenes, and it will move the data over, bring the database up, and then join both of the replicas to the availability group. So that's seeding mode. Database health trigger. Once again, when availability groups were introduced in 2012, the only thing that would force a failover was an issue at the instance level. So if you had an availability group with 5 databases in it, and one of those databases became unresponsive or unavailable, it would not force a failover. In 2016, they introduced this database health trigger. So setting that to true says I've got those 5 databases. One of those databases is in an unhealthy state. That will force a failover. DTC support, 2016, they enabled support for distributed transaction coordinator in availability groups. So I'm going to set that to true. And then finally, confirm equals false. Don't ask me any questions. Just do what I told you to do. So I'm going to run the new DBA availability group with that params block. Run that. I don't know why it's acting squirrely. Let me just confirm that nothing got created. Nope. One more time. Okay, it's running longer this time. Should run for a second and give me some feedback. While this is running, anybody have any questions about availability groups?
There's nothing on the chat, Frank.
Okay, let me see what is going on. had to put displays in or something to give me an idea what it's doing. Sometimes the black box is not your friend. Let's see what we got here. Okay, it's built availability group. All right, so it did return. Take a look at the output. So I believe it should have worked. Yep. Okay, so I had my world importers on my primary. I did not have an availability group. So I've now built out an availability group. You can see that I've got 2 replicas, primary and secondary. I look at my databases. I've got my wild world importers database. And then if I right click on that database name and say show dashboard, it will give me this dashboard and show me the health of my availability group. So at the high level, the availability group is healthy. And then down here, it shows me each of my replicas. Expand. Can't I find it? There we go. Each of my replicas, each replica is healthy. And then down here at the bottom, it's the database view. So it gives me each replica and the databases or databases and their health state. And because this is synchronous with an automatic failover, my synchronization state is synchronized. If this were async, that synchronization state would be synchronizing. And those are both healthy. That combination is healthy. There's other information available here for the health and just how the availability group is running. And all of that information can be pulled back using DBATools commands as well. So I've built my availability group. Everything's healthy. The database has been restored on the secondary side, and any changes that are happening on my primary will be reflected on my secondary. In this state, if I was to fail over, because of the way that the connection to these instances works, my application would be connected to VM1. So if I was to do a failover to VM2, the connection strings hitting VM1 for the databases in my availability group would fail because the database on the secondary side would be inaccessible. So what I can do is create a resource called a listener. And in this case, I'm going to create what's called the dynamic network name listener. And what the listener is a cluster resource that, based on the primary replica, the listener knows which replica is primary and will point, if you connect to that listener, it will point traffic to the correct instance, the primary instance. The dynamic network name listener was introduced in 2019, and it basically simplifies the creation of a listener when you're using Azure VMs. Prior to that, you had to create a load balancer and a bunch of other resources. So this just simplifies the process, and for the sake of my demo, makes things run quicker. And this is standard PowerShell code. This is not DBATools, but I just want to show you how to do this. I run that. Should have come back. If I refresh availability group listeners, I now have this listener, and if I can't connect from here, but copy this name out, I can't copy it from there either. FPG, CSSG. So I'm connected to the listener, and if I expand out my availability group and take a look at my replicas, you'll see that it's showing me the same thing. it show me VM1 being primary, VM02 being secondary. So I'm effectively connected to this instance. The bonus is that on failover, applications connecting through the listener will continue to connect. There is generally a blip. If you think about it in terms of pinging, it's 1 or 2 pings that the server is unavailable. So you do want to have retry logic in applications that are connecting to availability group databases, but it does make things really almost seamless. So from there, what I want to do is talked about DBATools being a migration tool to start with. Excuse me. One of the challenges kind of on that migration front with availability groups is because the failover is happening at the availability group level, anything that lives in my system databases is not being transferred between the availability group replicas. And two of the big things there are logins and agent jobs, because those live in the system databases master and MSDB respectively. So there is a command in DBATools called sync DBA availability group. So what I'm going to do is, if we take a look at agent jobs on my primary, you'll see that I have syspolicy purge history, which is a system job that gets created when the instance gets created. So I'm going to use a DBATools command called install DBA maintenance solution. And what this is going to do is it's going to install Ola Hollingren's maintenance solution, which is one of those things that, along with DBATools, is the coolest thing on the internet. It's going to install those on the VM01 instance in the master database. Replace existing says if it's already there, overwrite it, and then install jobs is going to create 7 agent jobs to do database backups, index maintenance, and integrity checking. So let me run this. And I need to talk to the people who run Azure Data Studio, because sometimes it will show me the output from the previous code block, which is what it's done here. But if I come back over here, refresh my agent jobs, I now have 7 agent jobs. Full backup for system databases, diff full and log backups for user databases, integrity checking for system and user, and then index optimize. So these are jobs that are part of Ola's solution. It's a really great way to run your backups if you don't have backup jobs. But those jobs have already been created on my primary instance. Because the secondary instance doesn't know anything about the MSDB database, those jobs don't show up here. However, if I run the sync DBA availability group command, I have the ability to sync everything you see in this bulleted list. So my SP configure settings, any custom errors, credentials, database mail, link servers, logins is a huge one, because I may create a login on my primary server, and if I fail over and that login isn't there, an application could stop working. The login permissions, and then all this agent stuff. The one that I'm interested in here is agent job. So what I've got is I'm setting some variables, my primary and secondary instance, my availability group, and then there is an exclude parm on this command. So if I want to only run agent jobs or sync agent jobs, I've got to exclude everything else. It's kind of clunky, but it's the way it's set up. So I will run this. And once again, it gave me my previous, or part of my previous output. But if I refresh jobs on my secondary server now, you'll see that all of these jobs now exist on my secondary server. And it's bidirectional. So if I have a job in this example, if I had a job on my secondary side that didn't exist on my primary, it would copy it. It would copy anything from primary that wasn't on secondary, and then it copies anything on secondary that's not on primary. And that's true for anything in that bulleted list. So if for some reason you create a login on the secondary side that isn't on the primary, it will sync it. And you can schedule this to run. You can schedule this to run as an agent job and run it periodically. You can also set it up to trigger off of an availability group failover. So when an availability group fails over, there is an error code or a code that gets generated in the log. You can set up an alert based on that code and trigger a job to run and do the sync. So you're always guaranteed that your replicas are in sync. And the last thing I'm going to do, I talked about being able to fail over, and there are there is a DBATools command to do the failover. It is invoke DBAG failover. Got a force parm here just to not let it get interactive. And then this second line, resume DBAG DB data movement. So the way that the failover command, if you run the failover command within T-SQL, it will stop data from transferring from, so I've got my primary, I've got my secondary. I fail from primary to secondary. The new primary will come up and the databases will be accessible, but it stops transferring data from that new primary back to the secondary because it's assuming that if an automatic failover happened, there's something wrong with the secondary instance or the secondary replica. So it stops doing that transfer back to give you time to check and see, okay, is everything good with the new secondary before resuming that data transfer. And you can do that through T-SQL, you can do it through SSMS, and you can do it through a PowerShell command. If you're familiar with failing an availability group over through Management Studio, you can right click on the availability group and say fail over. That process does this resume by default because it's assuming if you are manually triggering that failover, then you're good with that transfer happening again. So just a long way of saying why that resume DBA DB data movement is there. So I run this. So once again, it's slow in its display of output, but if I refresh right now on my secondary, what had been the secondary, I'm in secondary. If I do a refresh on this, oh, what the, okay. Get the right parms over here. Oh, okay. Sorry. Set those the wrong way. So the parms are new primary, so that's where I'm failing to. Old primary is where I'm failing from. I had those backwards. I run this. Cannot. Okay. I don't know exactly what happened there. It just took a second for the failover to happen. But my secondary, what had been my secondary is now primary. And if I come up here to 01 and do a refresh, and something else you might have noticed is that my dashboard over here, the secondaries only know about themselves. So you can see that where I had seen both replicas when this was primary, once that failover happened, this refreshed and I can just see the secondary. If I pull up the dashboard for what is now the primary, it'll look like it did before. So there you go. Everything's green, everything's good, life is good, The applications will continue to run. That is the end of this. So that is set. And jump back into my slides. Any questions, Ross? If not,
No, we're good.
okay. So just to review what we covered, kind of an intro to DBATools, information about that DBATools in a month of lunches book, about the website, all just the information that's available there. There is it's at PS DBATools is the Twitter handle for the DBATools team. If you have a question about something, they are generally very responsive. Please and thank you go a long way, but they are very, very nice people and they will answer questions. There is also a DBATools Slack channel where people like Chrissy Lemaire and Rob Sewell hang out and or just keep an eye on. So if you have questions, you can ask them there. Went over the options for high availability disaster recovery in SQL Server, and then configuring log shipping, monitoring failover clustering, and then configuring availability groups. Got a series of resources in the slide. A link to just the DBATools homepage, a link to the command list, that downloads option, and then Microsoft documentation about log shipping, failover cluster instances, availability groups, and then a link to the DBATools in a month of lunches book. And I haven't seen a pub date, but it's the actual print book is supposed to be available, I believe, sometime in June. So if you do want to get a hold of the actual physical copy, it will be available shortly. There are a couple of other in a month of lunches books. There's a PowerShell in a month of lunches and a couple of PowerShell scripting, but they're all really good books. Manning does a great job and they work with really, really smart people. So, and I don't get paid by them, if you're wondering. I just very much like their stuff. And then my contact info. If you have questions about what I've gone through, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or via email. Check my blog. There's some other cool stuff there. But any and all questions are welcome. I joke that I like to talk about this stuff and my wife doesn't. So any opportunity is a good opportunity. So that brings me to the end of my presentation.
Well, thank you, Frank. We do have one more question.
Sure.
That came up. If you don't do the resume data movement, what happens on the failback?
So it would actually I can show you what it would look like. So I can come here. Actually, I have to do it at the database level, I think. Come to my database. I can suspend data movement. So it gives me a wizard that and once this refreshes, I should be able to force it. Do what you're supposed to do. There you go. So you can now see that I have a big red X up here and I've got some warning symbols here because I am no longer synchronizing because I have suspended that data movement. So you can see that down here, O2 is my primary, O1 is my secondary. So my failover readiness shows data loss. So I can force this failover if I say, nope, got happy fingers. Sorry, it's been a while since I've worked with the GUI with this. Go to failover. Tells me here that I've got data loss. It gives me a warning that specified replica has one or more databases that are not synchronized. Click that. I have to check that. Click next. I've got to connect to that secondary. And it tells me what it's going to do. Once again, gives me a warning that there's data loss, the replica is not in failover ready state. So if I were to fail that over, anything, because that data transfer is suspended, anything that's happened on the primary prior to or between that suspension happening and now is not going to be applied, and that data is going to be lost. So I'm going to stop that. Yes. So I can then come in here and say resume data movement, which will hopefully succeed. Update Object Explorer. Now if I do a refresh here, it's green. Because there's no activity happening on the primary database, that happened really fast. If I had had that data movement suspended for an hour or two with a busy production instance or production database, there could be a lot of stuff queued up. And one other thing I'll show you here, and I said there's more information available here. It's also available for DBATools. If I click this Add Remove Columns link, I can get suspended and suspend reason. But one of the nice things about this is you will see, starting here with log queue send size, log queue send or log send rate, redo queue size, redo rate. Basically what these are telling you is, let's say I've got that data, the data transfer has been suspended for 2 hours and the primary database has still been active and there have been transactions writing to it. This log send queue size would tell me how much data is queued up on the primary ready to send. And then the log send queue rate would tell me how fast that data is moving over. So in the case of with the database, the data movement suspended, my queue size would continue to grow and I wouldn't have a send write because there's nothing being sent. Once I resume that movement, I would get that send rate and I would see that queue size decrease. And then the same thing with redo queue size and redo rate. Things can queue up on the secondary side, especially in the case of an async secondary where that notification's not going back. Things can queue up there. And once again, the redo rate will tell you how quickly you should clear that queue. So this can be really useful for troubleshooting availability groups because it'll tell you where your issue is. Is stuff queuing up on the primary waiting to send? Is stuff queuing up on the secondary? If you don't have a queue either place and you're still having issues with synchronization, then you may be looking at a network problem where the connectivity between the two replicas is either compromised or down or something. So it just can make it easier to figure out where your problem is. So I hope that answered the question. Anything else, Ross?
No, it sums it up.
Okay, cool.
And thank you, Frank.
You are quite welcome. Yeah, this is one of my favorite presentations I've done in a while. I like PowerShell, I like DBATools, I like high availability, so checks all the boxes.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks to everybody for coming out. Ross, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Well, you're welcome anytime, Frank.
All right. We'll take you up on that.